So big news came out this week. The banks went through their stress test, and this is really big news for banks, especially investors.
Oh, big news for people even too. You always hear it's like, oh my gosh, the banks are so weak right now. They're not going to be able to do anything. Well, you know what? Let's take away the emotions. Let's look at the facts. Let's look at the numbers, because numbers, well, they're here. Can't really lie.
And this is amazing. I mean, when you look at 2009, the worst time since the Great Recession, capital reserves now, that's what the banks have. That's how their capitals are made up. $1.2 trillion. It was $400 billion back in 2009. It's increased by $800 billion. We are very safe now on the banks.
Yeah, that's what you got to look at again. Those capital reserves, it's a very strong asset for the banks. Again, it's different accounting with those banks, so that's one thing you want to look at. It's known as common tier equity. Don't want to get too much into it because it gets very, very complicated, but it is a positive sign there. And what the stress test is, the worst case scenario that the Fed looked at, again, it's kind of an outside source, it's not in-house.
Right. The
Fed does this stress test. Look at this, stock market plunge of 65% and unemployment at 10%. Those are some drastic scenarios that the Fed tested for those big banks.
2008, we didn't hit that. 2009, we didn't hit that. So that's what they're looking at. I mean, in 2000 or 1929, it was a little bit worse than that, but still 65% market plunge, and things are much better regulatory now with stocks and so forth.
And what they want to test too is that the banks are able to lend during extreme circumstances.
Right. Let's talk about why this is a good time for investors to start looking at the banks. 32 of 35 banks set to raise dividends and buybacks, and some of these are substantial raises.
Well, they're substantial, and this is important because these 35 banks, well, they make up about 80% of all the assets of U.S. banks that operate here. And we'll talk about, J.P. Morgan. They're due a buyback of about $21 billion, plus increase their dividend by about 24 cents. Citigroup, they're going to do a buyback about $18 billion. So there's some big banks out there that are doing some big, big things for their investors.
I think next week we'll do a newsletter, I think on Citigroup. I think we'll do Citibank. So some didn't make it though. Some didn't do so well, like Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs. They didn't really, and it's kind of confusing. They got to raise, but not really.
Yeah, they didn't get to raise their dividend payout ratio. I think Goldman got to raise their dividend by about 5 cents. It wasn't as big as the other banks. They were limited. They got conditional approval from the Fed while the other banks passed. And then Deutsche Bank, they didn't pass.
They didn't pass on. Morgan Stanley? Yeah, okay. All right, well, that's now you know what the banks are doing, why maybe want to take a look at banks to invest in. I'm Brent Wilsey. Have a great day, great weekend as well.